Tech launches can make or break a product's reputation. Some launches like the original iPhone, the PlayStation 2, or Nintendo Switch are almost flawless. They're iconic, unforgettable, and often set new benchmarks for how technology is introduced to the world. These are the type of launches that tech companies dream of replicating, but not every product goes this way. Some launches are remembered for all the wrong reasons. Whether it's poor planning, technical failures, or just being way ahead of its time, these disasters serve as cautionary tales for the industry. Today, we're going to be diving into some of the worst tech product launches in history. We'll break down exactly what happened and why these tech launches are still talked about today. So let's start with the Galaxy Fold, a product that had the potential to completely change the smartphone industry. When Samsung announced it, people were blown away. A phone that folds out into a tablet, it sounded like something straight out of the future. It was supposed to launch in April of 2019, and the hype was off the charts. But then disaster struck. Samsung sent out early review units to journalists and influencers, and almost immediately, things started to go wrong. Screens were constantly breaking left and right, and some reviewers accidentally peeled off a layer of the screen, thinking that it was a screen protector. Others had problems with getting debris in the hinge, causing major malfunctions. It wasn't just a minor issue, it was a full-blown PR nightmare. Samsung had no choice but to delay the launch by several months, finally releasing the Galaxy Fold in September of 2019. By then, the excitement had cooled off, and the product itself felt very much like a first-generation device. The front screen was tiny and awkward to use, and the interior screen had this huge, unsightly notch. It was clear that while the concept was innovative, the execution quite wasn't there yet. But here's the thing, Samsung didn't give up. They took all of the criticism and went back to the drawing board. The very next year, they launched the Galaxy Z Fold 2, which was a massive improvement. Fast forward to today, and we're on the Z Fold 6, which is one of the most polished foldables on the market today. Now let's move on to another launch disaster. One that didn't involve a futuristic concept, but rather something that we use every day, maps. And specifically, Apple Maps. Back in 2012, Apple decided it was time to replace Google Maps as the default navigation app on iOS. On paper, it made sense. Apple wanted to control the entire user experience and not rely on a competitor for such an essential service. But when Apple Maps launched, it quickly became clear that the app wasn't ready for widespread use. The mapping data was wildly inaccurate. Entire towns were misplaced, landmarks were missing, and some roads didn't even exist. There were stories of people getting lost or being led into dangerous situations because of the app's bad directions. The backlash was immediate and intense. It wasn't just the tech world roasting Apple. Mainstream news outlets were covering the fiasco, and memes about Apple Maps flooded the internet. The situation was so bad that Tim Cook, Apple's newly appointed CEO, issued a public apology. And in an almost unheard move, he even recommended that users download competitor apps like Google Maps and Waze, while Apple worked on fixing its own service. To Apple's credit, they didn't abandon Maps. Over the years, Apple Maps was improved dramatically. It's more accurate now and has features like flyover views and cycling directions that can compete with Google Maps. But let's be honest, they're still playing catch up. The botched launch left a permanent stain on the app's reputation, and for many people, it's hard to trust Apple Maps even today. Apple Maps is a textbook example of why rushing a product to market, especially something as critical as navigation, can backfire in a big way. But as bad as this launch was, at least it didn't cost lives or batteries. And speaking of batteries, let's talk about one of the most infamous tech launches of all time, the Galaxy Note 7. Alright, so I'll try and keep this one brief, since I already covered the Note 7 in detail in my previous video about the downfall of the Note series. If you haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend checking it out for the full story. That said, the Note 7's launch was such a disaster that it absolutely deserves a spot on this list. When Samsung launched it in 2016, it looked like just another entry in their flagship Note lineup. It had top-tier specs, a massive display, and of course the S Pen. Fans were excited, and everything seemed to be going great until it wasn't. Reports started coming in about the phone's overheating and catching fire, and this wasn't just an isolated issue. It became widespread enough that Samsung issued a recall, replacing the faulty units with what they claimed to be safe devices. But then, even those replacements started to catch fire too. At that point, Samsung had no choice but to completely pull the Note 7 from the market. The fallout was catastrophic. Airlines banned the device, making it a global safety hazard, and it ended up being one of the largest tech recalls ever. Samsung took a massive financial hit, around $5 billion, but the damage to their reputation was even worse. This was no niche product like the Galaxy Fold, it was a mainstream flagship. That made the impact of its failure so much bigger and far more serious, especially since it posed a real safety risk. Thankfully, Samsung took this as a wake-up call. They completely overhauled their quality control and battery testing process, which has helped them avoid similar issues since. But the Note 7 will forever be a reminder of what can happen when you push a product out too quickly without doing thorough testing. And with that, let's move to a launch disaster that was a little less extreme, but still pretty memorable: Google Glass. When it was first announced in 2013, people were genuinely excited. The idea of wearing AR glasses with voice controls and a tiny display sounded futuristic and revolutionary. At the time, Google pitched it as this incredible piece of tech that would let you take pictures, get directions, and interact with the world in a whole new way, all without pulling out your phone. But as cool as it sounded, it quickly became clear that Google Glass wasn't ready for the mainstream. For starters, the price was a huge barrier. At $1,500, it was just way too expensive for the average consumer, especially since the functionality was pretty limited. And then there was the design. They were awkwardly shaped and made anyone wearing them stick out like a sore thumb. And then there was the issue of privacy. The built-in camera freaked people out, with many worrying that wearers could be secretly recording them without their knowledge. This led to bans in public spaces like bars and movie theaters. And because of all of these issues, Google Glass never officially launched to the public. It was only available as a part of their beta program called the Explorer Edition, and after a few years, Google quietly pulled the plug. That said, Google Glass wasn't a total failure. It paved the way for today's AR wearables, and many of the lessons learned from this flop has been applied to newer products. Still, it's a perfect example of a product that was just too far ahead of its time. But while Google Glass flopped because it was too futuristic, our next product, also a Google one, failed for being completely underwhelming. So let's move on to the Google Pixel Slate, a product that I was personally really excited about when it was announced in 2018. On paper, it sounded like Google's answer to the iPad Pro and the Microsoft Surface Pro, a high-end tablet that could also function as a laptop. But when it finally launched, it became pretty clear that the Pixel Slate wasn't what anyone hoped for. Let's start with the performance issues. The base model of the Pixel Slate came with an Intel Celeron processor, which was wildly underpowered for tasks it was meant to handle. Right out of the box, it was laggy and unresponsive, making it hard to take seriously as a productivity device. Sure, you could go for the higher end model with better specs, but they were just way too expensive, pushing the price well into the premium territory, and by that point, you might as well just buy a Surface Pro or iPad Pro. Then there was the problem with software. The Pixel Slate ran on Chrome OS, which is fine for Chromebooks, but it felt awkward on a tablet. Chrome OS just wasn't designed for touch input in mind, so using this device as a tablet felt clunky and unintuitive. Honestly, it would have made way more sense for Google to put Android in the Pixel Slate, but for some reason they didn't. And let's not forget about the keyboard accessory, which was supposed to turn the Slate into a laptop replacement. It was expensive, poorly designed, and just didn't work as seamlessly as the competition. Unsurprisingly, the Pixel Slate was a commercial flop. It was so bad that Google ended up publicly announcing that they'd be moving away from making tablets altogether, which was a pretty shocking admission from a company like Google. The Pixel Slate is a perfect example of what happens when a product tries to do too much and ends up not doing anything well. It wasn't a great tablet, it wasn't a great laptop, and ultimately, it just wasn't worth the price. So what can we take away from all of this? Each of these product launches, from the Galaxy Fold to the Google Pixel Slate, shows us exactly what can go wrong when companies rush to market, fail to understand their audience, or just don't execute properly. What's interesting is how some of these companies bounced back. Samsung didn't let the Galaxy Fold or Note 7 destroy the reputation. Instead, they made improvements, learned from their mistakes, and are still on top of the game today. Google, on the other hand, seems to have taken a different approach, stepping back from certain categories entirely after their flops. At the end of the day, these failures serve as important lessons, not just for the companies involved, but for the entire tech industry. They show us the value to listening to consumers, taking the time to perfect a product, and most importantly, owning up to mistakes. But which of these launches do you think was the biggest disaster? Or is there a tech flop that you think should have made the list? Make sure to subscribe if you've made it this far into the video, and let me know in the comments below.